Good afternoon, everybody, and I welcome all the participants for the second lecture of webinar series of Archaeological Sciences Center, IIT Gandhinagar. As all of you might be aware, we started this webinar series last month with the first lecture by Professor Ravi Kurisetter. The second lecture will be delivered by Professor Parth Chauhan from IISER Mohali. He is a well-known prehistorian and has done his work in various aspects, including stone tool technology, vertebrate palaeontology, and rock art studies. And he's been working extensively in northern India and central India, in particular the central Narmada and Tapi Basins, to understand the human behavioral evolution, then the associated environmental adaptations, and also the technological transitions during the Quaternary period. He is currently collaborating with various multidisciplinary specialists from India, Germany, Israel, and Australia. And he is also doing a collaborative project in Sudan to investigate the regional prehistoric records. I welcome Professor Parth Chauhan, and I request you to please deliver the lecture and enlighten us all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you for inviting me to give this talk. Good afternoon, everyone. So my topic of this lecture is prehistory. And I'll be talking about basically human evolution and different related aspects in India, particularly about animal extinctions, rock art, stone tools, and dispersals, various aspects of different discoveries and how they're affecting India as well. So just to define paleontology for the lay people, basically it means the study of ancient humans from a multidisciplinary perspective. We can include biology, geology, geochemistry. There's different disciplines we use to understand human evolution from a holistic perspective. So that means paleontology. So I'll start my presentation now. Just to give you a broad overview before I get to the Indian evidence, very briefly, we know that the earliest human fossils are found in Africa. So far, we have over 30 different species reported. We have at least 6 different genera. But the relationships between different species are not well worked out, mainly because the fossils are not abundant. And also, there's a lot of geographic gaps, temporal gaps in the record. So there's a lot of missing links between species, between lineages. We don't exactly know who or what our ancestors were exactly and which were not in our lineage. We're still trying to figure things out, but we have a much better idea in the last few decades based on new types of analysis, ancient DNA, new dates of some fossils, and also discoveries of new species. So this is just a very general introduction to the fossil record. And after, let's say, about 2 million years onwards, we start getting fossils outside of Africa. And I'll talk about that in terms of dispersals and distribution of sites. So key milestones in human evolution. What exactly happens when? If you look at our lineage, we become bipedal around 7 million years ago. And this is based on the current fossil evidence. This time might get extended maybe a little bit more in the future with new discoveries. Then the earliest stone tools appear around 3.3 million. Earliest evidence of butchery, 2.6 million. Our genus Homo appears at 2.8 million. And then around 2 million years ago, in fact, before 2.1 million years, our genus leaves Africa. We don't exactly know which species leaves Africa, and we don't know which routes they take, but this is based on evidence currently known from China. Then we have evidence of fire appearing, 1.4 million. And then gradually, once hominids leave Africa, there's also new species that evolve outside of Africa, in Europe, in Asia, various places. So we have Neanderthals evolving around 350,000 years ago. And then Homo sapiens evolving roughly at the same time, 300,000 years ago. And then we have multiple dispersals of different species, including Homo sapiens. They leave Africa starting around 200,000 years ago, and then 50,000 years ago, multiple dispersals take place. And I'll talk about that in more detail. And then 100,000 years onwards, we have the beginning of symbolic behavior, which is basically artwork, ornamentation, various kind of abstract designs. And then we have the only known species surviving, Homo sapiens, from about 30,000 years onwards. Before that, we were kind of contemporary with some species, and we were also kind of responsible for their extinction at some places. But it's not clear which species we came into contact with and how much interbreeding there was between the different species. And then 10,000 years ago, we have basically the beginning of the Neolithic, which is the last proper prehistoric phase and the beginning of domestication and agriculture. So you can see this is a very broad timeline showing key events in human evolution. And if you look at stone tools, they extend from 3.3 million years onwards. What is interesting is between 3.3 million and 2.6 million, there's a gap. So between Lomekwian and Oldowan so far, we have not found any evidence. Maybe in the future we might find new sites. And Lomekwian is currently represented by only one site. Now, 2.6 million years onwards, what happens is different technologies start dispersing and spreading within Africa. And then soon after 2 million years onwards, they start spreading out of Africa. So Oldowan leaves Africa, Acheulean leaves Africa, possibly Middle Paleolithic as well, and the younger technologies. Now, as the older technologies become established in Europe, in Levant, in Asia, it's not clear always when certain technologies are being introduced to these regions and when certain technologies are being innovated in these regions. But we have a continuous record from 2.6 million years onwards. And you can see the timeline on the right showing dispersal events, meaning when these technologies leave Africa or appear in other regions. After the late Acheulean, we have possibly inventions of certain technologies happening in a parallel manner across the old world. So it's not just that everything starts in Africa and keeps leaving the region. There's some things that leave Africa initially, but later on, the younger technologies start emerging separately as well, not only from an African dispersal. So I'm going to highlight my talk with key slides with these major questions, the big questions that we're trying to answer as scientists and paleontologists. So one of the biggest questions that we are trying to answer in a more collective manner, in a comprehensive manner, is what factors are responsible for biological, behavioral, and technological transitions. And this applies to all species, all time periods, in all regions, not just specific places. And what is the relevance of the Indian subcontinent in this discipline? First of all, it's located in the center of the old world. So it geographically links East Asian, Southeast Asian, European, West Asian, and African records. Stone tools here were historically discovered roughly at the same time as in Europe in the 1800s. We have continuous human occupation since at least 1.5 million, and maybe even 2.6 million, but it's not clear. We have technologies preserved from all prehistoric phases, including lower, middle, and upper Paleolithic and Mesolithic. And we also have extinct animal species, which I'll be talking about separately. So it had a very unique animal community in the past. And despite the number of sites, we have over 2,000 sites, known Paleolithic sites, classified into lower Paleolithic, middle Paleolithic, and upper Paleolithic. The problem is very few have been dated. So as you can see on this map, these are sites with certain dates. And some dates are reliable, some dates are not so reliable. Some have been dated in the 1960s and 70s and need to be redated. Some have been dated recently, so they're more reliable. But overall, we can say there's continuous human occupation from roughly around 1.5 million years onwards. This is based on stratigraphy, on the number of sites distributed everywhere, on the different contexts, and other indirect evidences, such as animal fossils, for example. So some of the key mysteries that we don't know for India subcontinent. One thing is, when do hominins first arrive in South Asia? This is a still unanswered question. So if you look at the global evidence, we have the earliest stone tools in China going to 2.1 million. We have Homo erectus fossils in Southeast Asia, 1.5 million years old. And then we have something like Homo erectus or Homo ergaster at 1.8 million in Dmanisi. So if they reach China by 2.1, we know they left very early from Africa. Now, it's also possible that some technologies, especially symbol technology like older one, might have been invented more than once. It's not necessarily that dispersal took place every time. It's possible that hominins left without the knowledge of stone technology and then invented it in China at the same time it was invented in Africa. But the reason we connect these evidences with Africa at the moment is because so far, everything outside of Africa is younger than the African American. And because these hominins became isolated geographically, like for example, Homo erectus or ergaster or habilis, whatever it was, when it reaches Southeast Asia, because of rising sea levels, the areas become islands, and these early hominins become isolated and they speciate. They change biologically and they turn into other species. So Homo habilis or whatever left Africa early, it turns into eventually Homo floresiensis, a very small individual. And they found these fossils dating from about 800,000 years to 50,000 years. And this is happening in different locations in Asia, because we have isolation in Philippines, for example, in Southeast Asia. So different pockets where there was geographic isolation, we have appearance of new species. And even places where there's no geographic isolation, like Europe, we also have appearance of new species, like the Neanderthals. Now, if you're looking at similar evidence in India, something old, around 2 million years old, for example, what is the problem? Why haven't we found this information? One reason is because if you look at everything below the Shivaliks, Central India, Peninsular India, the context, older than, let's say, 500,000 are very rare. So far, only half a dozen sites have been reported to be early Pleistocene, meaning older than 800,000 years old. This is one problem. Either these sites have not been recognized, or they've not been dated, or they're not exposed on the surface. There's many, many geological and historical reasons why these contexts are minimal. We need to actually carry out focus surveys and identify the older context to find the older sites. The time period we're looking for the earliest dispersal, let's say between 2.6 million onwards, is well represented in Shivaliks. The Shivaliks, they reported stone tools. They reported these cut mark bones recently from near Chandigarh in Masol. So most of the stone tool evidence that has been well studied comes from Pakistan, from the Siwalik Hills. So the problem with this evidence is, unlike the Chinese sites, the African sites, European sites, none of them are coming from excavated and well-dated contexts. They're from surface context, or they're from gravel context, or the artifacts are not enough, for example, to understand them properly. And the problem with the cut marks reported recently, it does suggest that they were maybe made by stone tools because of butchery 2.6 million years ago. But the problem with the cut marks is that experimentally, it's not really clear whether they're really made by stone tools or other processes. They could have been made by, for example, fluvial processes. They could have been made by other animal teeth chewing on these bones in the past. Just like we have predators like crocodiles, hyenas, monitor lizards, anything that chews on bones leaves marks that are similar to stone tools. What we need is basically stone tools and cut mark bones coming from excavated context and very, very minimally disturbed. We also need evidence that is older than 2.6 million between Africa and India. that shows kind of evidence of dispersal. At the moment, we don't have any evidence. The oldest evidence is Chinese evidence, which is 2.1 million year old. But what is interesting in the Siwaliks does suggest that there might be hominin presence out there. The reason is because if you look at the animal fossils from different sites, we look at Dalmanisi in Georgia, we look at Ubadia in Israel, we look at Sangiran in Southeast Asia, and then we look at the Pinjor Formation of Siwaliks, we find out that the ecology was very similar. The animal life was very similar. That means the ecology was similar, and the vegetation was probably similar. And the first three sites, Georgia, Israel, and Southeast Asia, have yielded hominin fossils. So it's probably a matter of time with systematic surveys and careful research that we might find hominin evidence in the Siwaliks that is not controversial and more convincing. So I'm trying to present this chronologically. Now, which species occupied India prior to Homo sapiens? I'll get to Homo sapiens in a few minutes, but before they get to India, what was there earlier? Based on archaeology, we can say that Homo erectus was probably there for 1.5 million years onwards. So this map shows this gray area, which is basically the main distribution of Acheulean sites. And Acheulean technology basically comprises hand axes, cleavers, and other bifacial elements. It's more complex than Oldowan and Lomekwian, and it's very, very widespread. And now we've started to get hand axes and cleavers and other similar tool types in East Asia as well. Now the debate is whether these sites represent Acheulean dispersals or represent independent mode 2 technologies that are separate from other parts of the old world. But based on the global evidence, a lot of Acheulean sites, the early ones, have Homo erectus fossils associated with them. So we know that the earliest evidence, which is Attirampakkam, 1.5 million years old, probably is associated with Homo erectus, but even though we don't have the fossil evidence at the moment. But it's also possible that maybe it was a different species responsible for these technologies. We cannot tell until we find contemporary hominin fossils. So these are the hand axes and cleavers typically represented with Acheulean, and they vary from site to site. Sometimes they have more hand axes, sometimes they have more cleavers, sometimes they have these core tools, sometimes they have more flake tools. It depends on the function of the site and what they were trying to do, the subsistence patterns, which hominid was involved. Because this technology, which is more advanced, lasts from 1.7 million all the way up to roughly 100,000 years. And different species were using this technology. So if you look at the fossil evidence in India, at the moment, everything younger than 40,000 is belonging to Homo sapiens. We have quite a few Homo sapien fossils. But if you look at things before Homo sapiens or something different than Homo sapiens, the only known or best record comes from Narmada Valley at the site of Patnora. So they found this cranium, partial cranium in the 1980s, and it was thought to be initially Homo erectus. Then some said Neanderthals, some said Heidelbergensis. So the problem is that it was fragmentary and non-diagnostic. If there were teeth preserved, for example, we could tell possibly which species was which species represented. But so what we know so far is that we know it's a female. We know it's not Homo sapiens. It's definitely older than 48,000 years. It could have been contemporary with the earliest Homo sapiens in India, or it could have been predating the Homo sapiens in India. We don't know this exactly because this specimen has not been dated directly. It's only been dated indirectly, meaning the context has been dated, but not the fossil itself. So we need to find more fossils. We need to link up the biological relationships between India and Asia and Africa and Europe. And the only way we can do that is by finding more fossils. And if you go forward in time, we come to this very interesting time period, which is between roughly 500,000 years ago and 300,000 years ago, with this transition happening. And this transition is unique because it's technological and biological at the same time. For example, we have these locations across the old world where the transition from late Acheulean to Middle Paleolithic happens. The emergence of lava technology, the emergence of core technologies, various prepared core technologies, points, for example, for hafting onto spears. So various advanced technologies appear almost at the same time between, say, 400,000 and 300,000. And what is also happening at this time is the emergence of new species. So technology changes at this transition, as well as this new species appear. So we have Homo sapiens appearing in Africa, we have the Neanderthals appearing in Europe, we have something else possibly appearing in India, but we don't have any fossil evidence. So it's only hypothetical at this point. But the archaeological evidence, again from Uttarampakam, suggests that similar changes were happening in India that were also happening in Levant, Europe, and Africa. So it's not always an African origin, but there's also multiple origins for certain technologies and also specific species. We also have similar looking hominins emerging in China as well. For example, the specimen from Dali. It broadly resembles other species and other specimens at this time period. So to hypothesize about India, what other species were existing in Eurasia? And Eurasia means Europe and Asia combined. We have Denisovans, known from Siberia and China. We have these red deer cave people, very young, about 15 to 10,000 years old. Homo floresiensis, 800,000 to 50,000 years old. And of course, which we're all familiar with, the Neanderthals, which are 400,000 to 25,000 years old. So there's many candidates at this time for India, but it's not necessary that all of these were present or even one of these was present. Homo floresiensis was mostly in Flores as an isolated, geographically isolated island, but these other species were on the mainland. So it's possible that we may be getting fossils of these species in the future. For example, based on archaeology, some have suggested that Homo neanderthalensis reached Pakistan because of Mousterian technology reported. And something else to keep in mind is that we might have new species in India that are not found in other parts of the old world. We won't know until we find more specimens. Now, another big question is, when does Homo sapiens first arrive in India? This is a big debate right now, especially last 10, 15 years. So if you look at the technology, what's happening at the time when Homo sapiens is emerging in Africa, we have the transition I talked about from Lower Paleolithic to Middle Paleolithic. Earlier, we thought that it's happening only in Africa, but now we know it's happening at multiple locations. Those multi-regional origin. Then around 300,000 years ago, we have Homo sapiens emerging in Africa. They disperse within Africa and then out of Africa multiple times. By 177,000, they're in Levant. Again, 125,000 Levant. 200,000, they're in Europe. So you can see there's multiple dispersals again and again from Africa by Homo sapiens and associated technologies over time. Now, the problem is that we have multiple species existing contemporary. If you look at a global evidence, you have Homo erectus, Heidelbergensis, Floresiensis, we have the Denisovans, we have Homo sapiens, and we have hybrids and growth species based on genetic evidence. So we don't know which hominins were where and when, and which hominins were using which technologies. So it's very, very complex now because we have a very complex situation compared to what's happening in Africa at this time. Here's a map showing these occurrences. So the skulls represent basically fossil evidence. In India, we have stone tools 77,000 years old and 114,000 years old, where the researchers are saying they belong to Homo sapiens because it resembles similar artifacts in Africa. The Australian evidence is again stone tools. No fossils have been found yet, but 65,000 year arrival is proposed. In China, by 100,000. So you can see that we have Homo sapiens migrating multiple times with different technologies across the globe. And India has a very, very important role to play in understanding this process because we have a very diverse group of people, ethnically diverse, genetically diverse, culturally diverse, a lot of languages, very rich history. For example, we have rock art, we have stone tools, we have many, many different traditions, behavioral traditions, cultural traditions, different types of behaviors, unique behaviors, adaptation to different environments, for example. So these things tell us that India has a very important role to play because certain signatures we find in India are not found in other places. And now we have also evidence of possible admixture with regional hominin species in Asia. Things that are not happening in Africa. So if you look at the archaeological evidence, genetic evidence, and fossil evidence, they give us different time periods for the arrival of Homo sapiens. Now, the fossil evidence at the moment, the oldest is about 38,000 years old from Sri Lanka, and that is showing an arrival by 38,000. Then we have the microliths, which is showing an arrival by 48,000. And this is exclusively usually belonging to Homo sapiens. The genetic evidence of modern hunter-gatherers is showing 60,000. And as I was saying, the Middle Paleolithic is now considered to be possibly belonging to Homo sapiens. 77,000 and 114,000 as I showed in the previous slide. Now the problem is that we're getting new sites showing an older Middle Paleolithic. So now it challenges, in a way, the younger Middle Paleolithic. So we can say it challenges and doesn't challenge at the same time. How is that possible? So it's possible that if the Middle Paleolithic emerged in India separately, maybe the younger Middle Paleolithic does not belong to Homo sapiens. Or it's possible that the earlier Middle Paleolithic was made by a different species, like Neanderthals or Erectus or Heidelbergensis, something we don't know yet. And the younger Middle Paleolithic was adapted by Homo sapiens. It is possible that sometimes in the past, different species were using the same technology over time. And we also have the same species using different technologies over time. So technologies, stone tool technologies, are not always reliable to identify species except from Mesolithic onwards, or you can say Upper Paleolithic onwards. So all of these evidences, fossil evidence, DNA evidence, archaeological evidence, gives us different time periods of arrival. Now, one thing that we don't know from this evidence is whether there was more than one dispersal of Homo sapiens into India. For example, the earlier dispersal could have brought Middle Paleolithic technology, then maybe the population died out, and a new population came in later with microlithic technology, and that population continued into modern contemporary South Asian populations. So it's not clear how many dispersals there were, but we do know that there's potential for older dates. So as I said, there are a lot of species existing in Asia at this time. And based on archaeology in India, we have different technologies appearing now and diversifying. So we have some sites with small hand axes. We have some Middle Paleolithic sites without any hand axes. We have some sites with exclusively Upper Paleolithic signatures. Some regions have no Upper Paleolithic signatures. Some areas, the Upper Paleolithic, the Middle Paleolithic, and the Mesolithic are mixed. So we have geographic overlap, spatial overlap, sometimes stratigraphic overlap, temporal overlap, and technological overlap. So around 60,000 years onwards, technologies have become diversified, very complex, and regionally start overlapping. So in some regions, for example, the microliths are missing. In some regions, Upper Paleolithic is missing. So we have basically absence and presence of different technologies across India from about 100,000 years onwards. And we don't know which species were responsible for all of them. For example, when Homo sapien enters India, regardless of the time period, there were other hominins existing in India, other species were there. How did they interact? Was there violence? Was there interbreeding? Or were the older hominin species already declining and Homo sapiens came in large numbers and gradually replaced them? We don't know what's happened in India because not enough research has been done, not enough fossils have been found. But in the European situation, it is clear that Homo sapiens eventually replaces Neanderthal populations following a long history of interbreeding. And then we have the Toba ash debate. We have this volcano Toba in Sumatra, which has erupted multiple times in the past. But 74,000 years ago, we have a super eruption. And all of this ash, because of the size of the eruption and wind direction, all of this ash gets deposited in the Bay of Bengal and all across India's subcontinent. And there's a debate now about the impact of this ash. For example, how much did it affect ecology, the air, the water, soil, fauna, flora? Did it affect human populations? And did technology change? So how would technology change in relation to the Toba eruption? So just to say hypothetically in very simplified manner, let's say that the hominins before the eruption were hunting large mammals with large points. And gradually, the eruption and the ash deposits affect the ecology and atmosphere. And the grasslands turn into forested zones. That means maybe the large mammals migrate or become extinct over time. And then the forested zones will accommodate small mammals. So large spear points are not needed for small mammals. So the hominin populations will adapt. The large spear points might decrease in number, or they might decrease in size. They become maybe small spear points or arrowhead shafts. So there's a technological change directly related to environmental change, which is directly related to the Toba eruption. This is a hypothetical scenario which I'm giving. At the moment, we don't know exactly what happened. The main problem is lack of primary or minimally disturbed sites with Toba ash. And even if we find sites with Toba ash, they don't always preserve artifacts below the ash and above the ash. So this is the problem, lack of primary sites. So far, only one site has been excavated extensively, which is Jwalapuram, but the post-Toba tephra artifacts are too young to assess any impact. So more data and more dates are required from across different zones. So there's a hypothesis now by other researchers saying that the impact of Toba was variable across the entire subcontinent. Maybe it was more impacted in southern India and less impacted in northern and western India, depending on the amount of ash on the landscape. Recently, they reported another site, almost the same team kind of, from central India, again suggesting continuity of technology. And this evidence seems to be better constrained between 79,000 and 65,000, showing continuation of Middle Paleolithic technology during and after the Toba eruption. But again, we need more evidences. We need more excavations. We need to look at this kind of evidence in different ecological contexts across India. And maybe after 10, 20 years of research, we might have a better idea of the actual nature of impact. And also, whether these Middle Paleolithic assemblages from Dhaba, from Jwalapuram, from Sandhav in Gujarat are actually associated with Homo sapiens or not. It's not clear, because advanced technology can also be made by other species. For example, the Neanderthals, they also made very advanced technology independently. The Upper Paleolithic is also a mystery. A lot of people have placed it in a separate phase, but now what's happening is we're finding it mixed with Middle Paleolithic assemblages. Sometimes we're finding it mixed with microlithic assemblages, and sometimes we're finding it exclusively. So basically, it represents blades, birons, awls, borers, bone tools, basically laminar technology or elongated technology, larger than microliths or larger than 3 centimeters. As I said, it overlaps now with microlithic technology and late Middle Paleolithic technologies. It's not always exclusive, and we hardly have any dates. One site in Pakistan has a date of 45,000, But the problem with this date is that it's contemporary with the Mesolithic evidence and the Middle Paleolithic evidence. Around 45,000 years ago, all of these different technologies are contemporary. So the transition is very complex. We don't have any excavations, wide-scale proper systematic excavations, specifically targeting upper Paleolithic sites from this perspective of trying to date them, trying to associate them with specific hominid species, trying to compare them with other upper Paleolithic sites outside of India. So we still need to actually target this problem in a systematic manner. Even though sites have been reported and excavated, we don't have any dates for these assemblages. And it's geographically variable. As I said earlier, it's missing in some places. In Eastern India, Southern India, and some places in Rajasthan, it seems to be very prominent. But other places, it's very, very minimal or almost absent. So it's not clear why it's absent in certain zones. It might be related to raw materials, it might be related to subsistence, cultural differences, we don't know. But we need to look at each area individually and find out. Because it's contemporary with microliths and late Middle Paleolithic, some have termed it the late Paleolithic. Now the problem with this term late Paleolithic is that kind of undermines regional diversity and it masks truly exclusive transitional entities. For example, some regions might have a proper transition from Middle Paleolithic to Upper Paleolithic to the Mesolithic. Other regions seem to go straight from Middle Paleolithic to Mesolithic. The blades, the burins are missing. So we need to understand why certain zones, this evidence is missing. And debates on the appearance of microliths is also a problem. Whether they were innovated in India or introduced from outside, they do occur from 48,000 years onwards. For example, Dhaba, Metakhedi, and Fahian cave in Sri Lanka. Patna is the only site that preserves the transitional sequence, but it remains undated. This technology continues into historical times. So when we're finding Mesolithic sites or microlithic sites, we don't exactly know the age. It could be historical age, it could be prehistoric age, or even protohistoric age. Another interesting phenomenon is, again, just like the Upper Paleolithic is missing in some zones, the same thing can be applied to the Neolithic. This is also missing in some zones. So in Western India, Central India, this phase or the technological manifestation is missing. There's a transition from microlithic straight into the younger time period. So we have Chalcolithic phase, we have the Neolithic phase, then the microlithic phase, complete sequences present in some zones, but other zones, we have the Neolithic evidence missing. So again, uneven transitions are happening across the subcontinent, probably related to different environments, different climates, in different cultural populations. And that brings us to Northeast India. Again, very important zone, very understudied. We have a lot of sites reported historically. And as you can see, the Denisovan fossils reported from Tibet, 160,000 years old, are very close to Northeast India. Now, the question is whether it was a corridor or not between mainland India and Southeast Asia. So we have almost all the evidence dominated by Neolithic. We don't have any convincing Paleolithic evidence. We have unreliable dates at the moment, unreliable context. No Paleolithic sites have been excavated from undisturbed context so far. But it does not mean necessarily that Paleolithic is absent. We need more systematic research. We need to target specific context. We need to date some context and see if we can actually extend the age of the Paleolithic and see if we can link it up with other surrounding regions. Maybe it's possible that as hominins move from west to east, as the ecology changed, animal life changed, maybe the technology has also changed. Maybe we should not be expecting Acheulean or Middle Paleolithic in their traditional sense in Northeast India. And then we come to the animals. We have a large variety of animals in the past. Many of them are extinct now. But the question is whether they were becoming extinct because of climatic factors or because of humans. So we have Asian grasslands spreading. And this is just to show you how dispersals took place with the mammals. 3 million years onwards, you have the grassland spreading. So what happens with the grassland spreading from Africa onwards, we have kind of like a chain reaction. The grasslands are spreading, forest areas are decreasing. So we have these migrations of herbivores also increasing. The animals, these herbivores, are associated with grasslands and they're following the grasslands. So migration is happening ecologically on the landscape. And because of the herbivores, we have predators and scavengers, and gradually we have hominins, all interconnected. There's a chain reaction based on the ecological changes and then hominin dispersals. So this is how basically different animal species migrate from Africa. And of course, they're migrating much earlier as well, even before the appearance of hominins. So India is a very rich vertebrate fossil record. We have hundreds of sites known, but again, the same thing with the actual records is that they're not well dated. We don't have any dates, reliable dates for the oldest evidence. We have a lot of late Pleistocene evidence, and we have a dichotomy. So we have the earliest fossil evidence, quaternary evidence coming from Siwaliks, and the youngest evidence coming from peninsular India. And we have a major gap in between. Middle Pleistocene, or between, let's say, 800,000 and 100,000, roughly, you have a gap. The main reason is because lack of dates, lack of context, lack of preservation, and lack of actual research. So we don't know the relationships between the Siwalik mammals and the peninsular mammals. How many migrations were going on, which animals were existing where, what was the extent of each species, for example. But we do know based on broad studies that there's a continuity of these animals. They continue, at least for the last 200,000 years, there's major continuity between the fossil record and the modern species. But there's still extinctions. And it's not clear what the factors were, trying to find out. For example, hippos become extinct. So hippos extend to at least 15,000. And what was the cause of their extinction? We don't know. We don't find hippo sites with artifacts. Meaning we don't find butchery evidence. We don't see evidence so far of large-scale hunting by humans. It's possible that the extinction happened ecologically. Maybe humans started encroaching on certain zones because 40,000 years onwards, the entire subcontinent was highly populated. This is based on genetic evidence. So we have a large population already established in India 40,000 years ago onwards. So already there's pressure on these animals ecologically. So maybe it's possible that a combination of ecological marginalization or encroachment by humans, partial hunting, partial climate change, various factors led to their extinction. Now, ostriches, we have a bit more direct evidence because we have evidence of exploitation of ostrich eggs. One, of course, for the food, then for making beads, engraving them, various purposes of ostrich eggs. Based on the eggshell evidence, they're basically widespread in central India, northern India, and western India. And association with artifacts suggests broad ecological overlap. And one big factor is whether we were responsible for their extinction. If you look at the geological record, the dating of the ostrich eggshells, which is not abundant, but we have some dates, and looking at occurrence of the absence of ostrich eggshells, they also seem to disappear around 10,000 years ago. Maybe it was, again, combination of factors: human, climate, environment, vegetation, rainfall, many, many things. In a recent paper, which just came out a few days ago, again, suggests that different factors were responsible, but especially coevolution with humans. And besides ostrich and hippo, we also have extinction of both Pneumaticus, Equus pneumaticus, Stegodon pneumaticus, and Palaeoloxodon pneumaticus. So these are various elephant, cattle, and horse species. So these guys are becoming extinct in the last 30,000 years, 40,000 years. And again, what the relationship is with the hominins is not clear. But if you look at it from a broad perspective, uh, it kind of matches other zones, Africa, Australia, North America, meaning when Homo sapiens enters and colonizes these regions, large mammals start to decline over time. So there might be a broad relationship with some species more than others in terms of relationship with predator-prey relationship with Homo sapiens. This is one of the things we're trying to answer in our Narmada Basin Paleolithic project. We're looking at animal fossils all across the valley and see which animal fossils represent natural deaths, which represent possibly hunting by humans, and how these sites are forming, how old these fossils are, for example, what the relationships are with the Siwalik mammals. So we're trying to excavate these sites, we're trying to date these sites. We're also looking at stable isotopes to reconstruct the great environments. And we're trying to understand how many of these sites, by going back to known sites especially, what they mean. How do we interpret them? For example, the site of Samnapur yielded stone tools in association with animal fossils. But that does not necessarily mean that it was a butchery site. Maybe the animal fossils and the stone tools became mixed together due to geological processes. So we need to understand all these associations and interpret them properly using different methods. And finally, I come to the nature of the prehistoric symbolic behavior. And when I say symbolic behavior, that can mean a wide range of things. So if you look at the earliest evidence, just to give you a background, we have shell beads appearing in Africa and Levant 120,000 years ago. This is ornamentation. Any behavior like ornamentation, art, any kind of abstract behavior, extra behavior beyond subsistence is called symbolic behavior. Then we have engraved ochre from South Africa, 77,000 years old. Now, what was the exact meaning of these specimens? We don't know, but they do represent intentional or conscious production of specific geometric design. And the same design eventually gets carved onto the ostrich eggs. Keep in mind that these eggs were carved when they were complete. Even today, the Kung San in South Africa carve ostrich eggs. And then they eventually break and we find fragments on the landscape. In South Africa, some sites have yielded hundreds of fragments, but in India at the moment, we only have one fragment from Pakne. And we're also in the process of re-excavating Pakne and trying to understand the dates for the entire sequence. So this is, again, evidence of symbolic behavior. But what happens in Europe is very unique. It's not found anywhere else. Around 45,000 years ago, there's an explosion in symbolic behavior in terms of paintings, in terms of figurines, engravings, other abstract designs. It starts appearing. And that is kind of in sync with Homo sapiens arriving into Europe again. We do have some paintings associated with Neanderthals, around 65,000 years old, but they're very, very few and controversial. So maybe it's possible that the Neanderthals were painting occasionally, but Homo sapiens were painting maybe more frequently and abundantly. In India, our symbolic behavior is dominated by rock art. So we have abundant rock art all over across the subcontinent, but we also have abundant beads made from ostrich eggshells and one fragment of engraved ostrich eggshell found so far. Hopefully we'll find more in the future to understand the relationship with the African specimens, or maybe there was no relationship and there was independent behavior. Here's a distribution of different rock art sites. As you can see, they're mostly concentrated in central and southern India. And if you look at the engravings, for example, engravings are dominant in northern India and southern India, whereas central India mostly has paintings. And you can see a state-wise breakdown, and this compilation of different sites is in progress. So we will eventually expect several thousand sites ultimately based on publications. But most of them are in Tamil Nadu, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan. And wherever there's no suitable rock for engraving or for painting, we won't get the rock art. It doesn't mean the knowledge wasn't there. It means the actual context is not there. And what is most common is animal figures, followed by geometric designs, followed by human figures, and then a wide range of things, including battle scenes, inscriptions, floral designs, dancing scenes, hunting scenes, many things. But we're just trying to understand now from a geographic perspective, which themes were important in different parts of India. So the key questions for Indian rock art, if you look at it from a broad perspective, what we need to answer is first of all the age. Because now we're getting 65,000-year-old and 40,000-year-old paintings in Europe. We're getting 45,000-year-old paintings in Southeast Asia. In India is in the center. Unfortunately, we don't have any old dates yet for African rock art. But if India is between Europe and Southeast Asia, maybe Indian rock art is also equally old. Another thing that we need to understand is whether this tradition of painting was introduced by incoming populations, or was it innovated after they reach India, or maybe a combination of the two. Why I'm saying this is because if you look at the global rock art, the European rock art, Levantine rock art, African rock art, Africa, of course, various locations, then the Indian rock art, Australian rock art, and Chinese rock art. If you look at it from a broad perspective, they're all regionally diverse. That means that there's probably a lot of diversification that happened very early. So it's possible that the oldest paintings are actually not preserved anymore. Maybe they're faded away. If that's the case, then we'll never know the actual age of the oldest paintings. But if we start now collecting samples and dating a lot of these sites, we might get an idea of at least the younger paintings, if they're datable. Also, we need to understand the purpose. What was the purpose of these paintings? Did it represent territorial markers? Did it represent painting something for good luck? Or just decoration in the cave or rock shelter? What was the purpose of these paintings? Was it to attract partners? And also, most importantly, what was the identity of the painters? We always assume that they were painted by tribal groups, but in the proto-historic times and historical times, we get also a lot of these younger themes, like horseback riders, for example, battle scenes, herding scenes, cattle scenes. So it's not necessary that all the paintings were made by tribal groups or hunter-gatherers. It's also possible that some of the younger ones were made by non-hunter-gatherers. Maybe they're made by pastoralists. Some were made by farmers. So we need to understand the relationship and the use of space and the significance of the paintings from an anthropological perspective, scientific perspectives. And we need to get a lot of more dates to understand and compare this evidence with other parts of the old world. And that is the end of my talk. I would like to thank everybody for their attention. And if you have any questions or comments that I'm not able to answer today or you think of later, my email address is on the bottom.
Thank you, Parth Chauhan. Thank you for delivering a wonderful talk summarizing the various evidences from the Indian subcontinent in the context of findings from Africa, Europe, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. Now, I request Sharda to please take over and put forth the questions from the Q&A section.
Okay, so before we begin with the questions in the Q&A, and I'll go through the chat box too, I have a question of my own. Considering the kind of advances that have happened in DNA genome sequencing, and in the context of the recently published paper on Grandolina remains of Homo antecessor, where they were able to isolate not DNA, but proteins, ancient proteins using paleoproteomics, using that kind of technology that's now available, why have we not attempted to reassess the Narmada fossil remains in order to address this question of what species it was, or what was the biomolecular makeup of this species? I understand a decade ago, 20 years ago, when the fossil was found, this kind of technological advance was not available to us. But why have we not tried? If I understand, if DNA hasn't survived and it cannot be sequenced, but now that we can look towards paleoproteomics and metabolomics, why have we not tried that for these few hominin evidences that we have from South Asia or the Indian subcontinent in order to address the question that is so important for us?
That's a good question. Based on my discussion with colleagues several years ago, I'm talking over a decade, I know that some colleagues of mine wanted to access the specimen, Narmada specimen, for dating purpose. And at that time, I remember that for dating purpose, the authorities were not allowing access to the specimen because it's a destructive method. And even sampling it for DNA or proteins, it's a destructive method at some level, even if it's minuscule. So first of all, getting permission is one thing. And even if you get permission, chances are that preservation is unlikely because it's a reworked and secondary deposited fossil.
But
of course,
of protein surviving,
yeah,
the chances of protein surviving are much higher when compared to DNA.
Yes.
And the same protein sequences can be used to answer many of these questions, which otherwise DNA can also answer.
Yes. So not only for the protein and DNA, but also for the dating.
Yes.
If the specimen can be dated directly and then combined with the protein evidence, the results, then we can say much more. Yeah. If you get a protein evidence, if we find out what species it is, but we don't know the age, then we can't really relate it to the whole scheme.
Yes. Okay. So I'll read out the questions from the top. So currently there are 16 of them. The first one is from Sanjeev, who says, what do labyrinth maze-like etchings at Pansaimol rock art indicate?
The labyrinth?
Labyrinth maze-like etchings at Pansaimol rock art indicate.
Right. So a lot of these designs that are done, not only in Pansaimol, but also in the paintings, you have a lot of these abstract designs and we don't have a knowledge of the purpose. They could be religious, they could be decorative, they could be territorial markers. There's many, many different hypotheses. So we won't actually know the exact purpose until we maybe date them, if you get them excavated context, if you find associated artifacts with them, for example. We need many more evidences to understand the purpose. But most hypothesize that they're very young.
Oh, okay. So the next question is a bit ambiguous because it doesn't mention what fossil, human or animal, but it says it's by Krishna Kripa, who asks, in India, at which place was the first fossil found and also in which year? And he or she goes on to ask, did mammoths exist and was the fossils of mammoths found in the Indian context?
Yeah, we don't actually have, we don't call them mammoths per se. So we have, in an Indian context, we have Stegodon, for example, we have Elephas, we have Palaeoloxodon, we have all these different species, but we don't actually use the term mammoths or mastodons. They're used more in the Asian and North American context, European context.
So the next one is also a very broad question. Ashish Ohal asked, how can we distinguish different species of human skulls, bones, because to him they all look alike or nearly similar. So this is a very broad question.
How can we establish different species?
Of human skulls, bones.
Yeah, so number one thing we need actually would be very diagnostic is teeth. If you have teeth, we can actually, I try to identify which species it is because sometimes the teeth are more diagnostic. If we have fossils, we need the cranium to be complete. But even if it's a complete cranium, sometimes what happens is that 50% of the traits are primitive and 50% of the traits are advanced. So if that's the case, then it's very difficult to name the species. We have a lot of ambiguous species in the middle Pleistocene that look like a little bit like Homo sapiens. They look a little bit like Erectus. They look a little bit like Neanderthals, but we can't always pick a species name. So we need, for example, protein or DNA or teeth or different parts of the skeleton, for example, along with the cranium, then we can work out the species after comparing it, for example, morphometrically with other known specimens.
Professor Jeevan Kharakwal asks, he first, of course, congratulates you for a wonderful talk, and then he goes on to ask, do we have non-Acheulean sites in India? And if out of Africa theory is correct, then how do we understand the early date for the Middle Paleolithic site of Atirampakkam?
Hi, Jeevan. So non-Acheulean, we have assemblages, if you can call them non-Acheulean, only based on the absence of bifaces, for example, or absence of Lavalva. We do have chopping assemblages. For example, they're there in Siwalik, they're there in other parts of India, but whether they are actually culturally or adaptively different or contemporary with other technologies is not clear. It's possible that they're just making different tools in a different context. So maybe Acheulean populations are making non-Acheulean tools in different ecology. When there's raw material constraint or lack of raw materials, for example, just like recently reported from Africa. They found Oldowan and Acheulean tools in the same horizons, the same time periods. So that's one way to look at it. Until we find exclusive non-Acheulean, pre-Acheulean and non-Acheulean assemblages from excavations, we can't be sure. And the second question was about out of Africa and the earliest Middle Paleolithic. So in my opinion is we are getting early Middle Paleolithic, seems to be indigenous in India, but there's two things to keep in mind about that. Number one site is not enough. We need more sites with more evidence. Second is that Atirampakkam evidence at the moment, it represents only the Atirampakkam area. It doesn't speak for the entire subcontinent. It's possible that the transitions happen differently in southern India and the transition happened differently in northwest India. Because the chances of populations getting close to northwest India from outside are much higher, and it was more like an entry point. And getting all the way down to South India, maybe there was a different system. So it's possible that different parts of India had different transitions. We cannot use only one site to talk about out of Africa or not out of Africa. We need multiple excavations across India, and then we get the full picture.
Okay, Arjun asks, early and mid-Holocene population and cultures show rapid heterogeneous movements within the Indian subcontinent. Is it not possible that diverse species coexisting and advances in tool technology and art was rapidly adapted? Particularly South India has been so diverse in its population dispersal since ancient period.
Yes, we can't say species because we don't have any evidence of different species at that time period, even outside of India. From 30,000 years onwards, at the moment, we seem to be the only species. Now, I showed you a photograph of the red deer cave people in China, which is about 15,000 years old. They're not given a species name, but they're also not called Homo sapiens. So in India, we might have similar situation where morphologically or anatomically, they're different. Maybe they're not a separate species, but they look very similar with some variations. And it's just like we have some young skulls in Africa, 10,000, 15,000 years old, and they have Homo erectus features. So it depends on what we find in the future. We need more fossils to actually answer that question. At the moment, we're only going by archaeology. We don't have any other evidence. And 10,000 years ago, at the beginning of Neolithic, it's more or less Homo sapiens.
Okay, the next one is, why is it your theory on wild animal extinction of a few species, I guess, due to human hunters is overlooked on wild flora diet?
Okay, so I wouldn't say it's overlooked at the moment. One reason is because we don't have enough excavated sites. For example, we have excavated many stone tool sites, but they don't always preserve fossils. And when we find fossil sites, they don't preserve stone tools. So we haven't found enough evidence of hunting, direct hunting or scavenging or butchery. We haven't found that evidence. So without that evidence, the next factor we look at the moment is climate. So under both headings, we don't have enough evidence. The climatic evidence is also lacking. The butchery evidence is also lacking. So both of them will be affecting the animal communities variably, depending on the species and depending on the time period.
Okay. Shuchi Gupta asks, these ornaments are the result of surplus evidences in the society?
Which ornaments?
I am guessing the beads and.
So what is the question again? The full question?
So there's no question. I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but it says these ornaments are the result of surplus evidence in the society.
Surplus of time. The hypothesis is that once these communities start settling down and hunting, they started getting more time for creativity. And that leads to innovation in symbolic behavior.
Krishna Kripa asks, what was the main purpose of cave paintings?
Yeah, we don't have an answer for that. There was no single purpose, actually. There was multiple purposes in different locations. So cave paintings in Europe will have a different purpose, and that also within Europe, different purposes, by the way. So some cave paintings are found at the entrance of the cave. Some cave paintings are found 2 kilometers deep into the cave. And in India, all the paintings are found in the rock shelters, which are very easily accessible and visible. So some paintings were meant to be seen by the entire community, and some paintings were not meant to be seen by the entire community. So it varies from painting to painting and site to site. Maybe the deeper ones in the European caves had some religious significance, maybe.
The next question is by Jay, who asks, how much do climate and population densities impact the quality and quantity of fossil finds or rock art?
The population levels and
the climate.
Yeah, they do affect a lot. We have found evidence of vandalism at many of the rock art sites. There's also development and illegal mining affecting rock art sites. And also the climate, of course, pollution, for example, general natural elements affecting the paintings. There's many factors that are regularly affecting the paintings. And that's why I was thinking that maybe the oldest paintings have not survived anymore. They might have faded now. And they're fading regularly.
Yeah. The next question is by I don't know who, so I'm going to address this as anonymous. How do you view the Mesolithic Chalcolithic transition and the absence of Neolithic sites in Gujarat?
So I think if you look at the Neolithic, there could be 2 ways to look at this. One is ecologically, and one is adaptation-wise. So it's possible that in some places we might have a very complex scenario. So in eastern zones and southeastern zones, we have the Neolithic is prominent with polished axes. Then we might have a different scenario where we have the Neolithic present, the Neolithic lifestyle is present, but without the polished axes. That's also possible. And the third is no Neolithic lifestyle and no polished axes at all. So we have different levels of evidences found in different locations. Now, if you look at Gujarat and Rajasthan, these are very arid zones. It's possible that as migrations took place, whether it's from west to east, east to west, different directions, maybe in an arid zone, there will be less vegetation, less forests. And if there's less forests, maybe there's less need of polished axes. If there's no wood to chop, maybe you would not need to make these axes.
I'm going to address some pertinent questions here. Sanjeev says public is not aware about prehistoric cultural material and its interest or importance. Some of the identified prehistoric sites are not protected enough. Is there something being done for this?
Yes, I mean, a lot of us professionals are now getting together and trying to protect sites at a regional level, at an individual level. And we're also trying to now having discussions amongst each other to get something officially done. For example, cultural resource management is not happening. So these laws can be introduced. Specific policies can be changed or updated. So things are happening, but not at the speed at which they should maybe. But people are becoming aware now that a lot of these sites are becoming destroyed. Actually, even the local villagers in some cases have taken things into their own hands. Like, for example, at the site of Bori, the villagers wanted to protect the volcanic ash, for example. But in South India, in Jalapuram, the volcanic ash is mined for various purposes. So you can see variations of how locals also treat these sites. And it's also a matter of just making them aware of how to protect the sites, how to inform the specialists if something happens. And also it's our responsibility, I think, to keep an eye on where things are developing, where construction is happening. And maybe I also encourage students to take up research topics where they can do salvage archaeology, for example, instead of doing research on protected sites.
This was a question that was addressed even in the previous lecture, the first lecture by Professor Ravi Korisetta. And Professor Kharakwal addresses it again when he says, Parth, can you explain why we have not been finding hominin fossils in India? The $1 million question, $1,000,000 question.
Yeah, I get this question a lot, so I have an answer ready for that. So there's many reasons actually, not one reason. I'll tell you from chronological perspective. One thing is that we have our research history is different. Research history in Africa and China and Europe is different compared to the research history in India. In these places, there was always a specific project looking for hominin fossils. And not just projects and funding, but also specialists. In India, we have hardly any specialists who recognize hominin fossils in the field. It's possible that archaeologists, if they come across human fossils, we won't recognize them. We might think they're just animal fossils. So in the past, historically, maybe fossils were ignored, they were not collected, or a lot of things were collected, but then not studied properly. It's possible that somebody collected a hominin fossil without knowing, like a fragment of a bone, teeth, and anything. So that's one reason. The history of the research is one reason, but also because we don't have expertise, number one. Number two, we haven't looked at it from a very problem-oriented manner. We haven't gone out to specific fossil-rich zones and looked for hominin fossils. Because earlier people think that hominin fossils are not preserved in India. But if you think about from a paleontology perspective, we have abundant animal fossils. So Narmada Valley, Son Valley, other places, we have abundant animal fossils. So we should eventually get hominin fossils. It's a matter of looking. I don't think we have looked enough actually. Most people have focused on stone tools, or they're focused on Harappan sites, or they're focused on younger sites like temples, for example. So enough surveys and systematic approaches have not been conducted.
So the next question is by Tosavanta, who asks, large collections of Pleistocene animal fossils have been made so far in India, but why cut mark evidences are not common in the Indian context? Are there any methodological challenges to this?
Hi Tosha, good question. I wouldn't say that cut marks are absent yet. I wouldn't say that. This is the same problem with the hominin fossil question. In my opinion, a lot of stuff has been collected, but it has not been studied properly. I don't know, for example, personally how many of these specimens collected were analyzed for cut marks. It's possible they were collected, the species was identified, and then it was reported and published, but maybe not analyzed for cut marks. It's possible. Another thing is that we haven't targeted sites with stone tools and fossils together. We get stratigraphic associations, but not behavioral associations. So again, it's a lack of research. I think it's a lack of research. It's not absence of evidence, it's mostly lack of research. It's a matter of time until we find that evidence.
Tisha says mesmerizing talk. And then she asks, I wish to understand, in the absence of any perennial river, how do you interpret the presence of a very coarse mainland sediment measuring 1 to 2 millimeters in the inlets of the sea areas or sea coasts, I guess?
Can you repeat that? In the absence of
In
perennial
the
river?
absence of any perennial river, how do you interpret the presence of a very coarse mainland sediment measuring between 1 to 2 millimeters in the inlets of the sea?
I'm not a geologist. I'm not exactly understanding the question, but if I understand it correctly, I would say that it's kind of contradicting, the question itself is contradicting itself in a way, because if you do have the coarse material, that does suggest the presence of perennial rivers in the past and the coastal zones. But if you don't have evidence of perennial rivers in the coastal zones, then the source of those sediments will be something else. So it's a circular argument. You would need to investigate what exactly those sediments are. Just because they're coarse doesn't mean they have to come from a river. They can also come from colluvial context, surface wash.
There's an anonymous attendee who asks, can you explain the glacial periods in India? Again, a very wide.
Yeah, we don't have anymore. See, the old system of having 4 glacial periods, according to the European system, is now rejected. So now we don't actually call them glacial periods. We call them marine isotope stages, MIS. So we have many marine isotope stages in the past. So basically, it's not exactly glacial and interglacial, but it's basically warm and cold periods. We don't have specific long-ranging ice ages, for example. And even when we do have an ice age, during the ice age, we have specific small durations of warm periods. And during the warm periods, we have small episodes of cold periods. So it's not that each and every ice age is recognized with a name anymore. We go by marine isotope stages.
Saurabh asks, why do you mention that northeastern India is or could be a corridor for the Homo migration or dispersal, though we don't find any skeletons there?
So, first of all, we don't need skeletons to establish a corridor. Even stone tools is enough. I'm saying that might have been a corridor because we have 1.5 million year old Homo erectus in Southeast Asia. Now, we still don't know whether they came from China or India. We don't know which route they took. Did they go from Central Asia to Southeast Asia, or did they come from India to Southeast Asia? We don't know actually. So not enough research has been done in Northeast India. It's very challenging because of vegetation, the terrain, the climate is very challenging. But maybe there might be cave sites there which has very early evidence. It's a matter of time until we find something.
This is a very different type of question. Have any paleontological searches been undertaken in the south, especially between the Rameshwaram and Sri Lanka area?
As far as I know, nothing systematic and long-term or targeted, as far as I know. I know that occasional fossils have been reported from different locations, but these are chance finds. They're not part of systematic targeted expeditions.
So I'm just quickly going to the chat box now. So there's one question from Manikandan who asks, is there any evidence of cannibalism?
In India or globally?
Globally, I'm sure there are lots of evidences, but again, debatable, but let's say in India.
In India at the moment, we don't have any convincing evidence of cannibalism, but even the evidence outside of India is controversial.
It's controversial.
We have cut marks on the hominin fossils, but whether it's cannibalism or ritualistic defleshing is two different things.
Ajay asks, any fossil or skeletal evidence of giant rodents or rats and giraffes in southern India? I have come across prehistoric paintings portraying a hunting scene where a clan of hyenas are hunting down giraffes in Rancherla near Jwalapuram. Also, several paintings of giant rodent species that look like kangaroo rats in the same site can be found. So any fossil or skeletal evidence?
No such fossils have been found yet. And those paintings are probably, they might have been misinterpreted. It's not necessary that they depict what people think they depict, or it's possible that it's very young historically and represents just people witnessing these animals somewhere else and painting them here.
Manika then also asks, can you explain about the baby skull which was found at Odai in Villupuram district of Tamil Nadu?
Yeah, so that skull is controversial because it is supposedly encased in laterite. And laterite usually doesn't preserve fossil evidence, number one. But number two, there's no physical evidence of a fossil in that context. So far, the researcher has not proved that there's a fossil inside. I think a CAT scan was done a long time back, but other than that, there's no convincing evidence that there's a fossil inside.
I think I'll just take one or two questions more. Arun asks, what are the possibilities of Indian Palaeolithic sites or populations having used biodegradable tools like bone tools, bamboo, etc., similar to the finds in similar to Indonesia? Because a setting like Kerala, for instance, which has a tropical setting, is quite similar to that of Indonesia, and there's possibility of the usage of such biodegradable materials and objects made out of them.
Yeah, the chances are very high. It's just a matter of preservation. If there's any cave site, for example, then you have a better chance of preservation. Yeah, not just Kerala, but anywhere. They were probably using the biodegradable material more than stone, actually.
True. And the final question, I hope I have taken most of them. So the final question is from Ajay, who asks, what are some fossil red zones in South India?
Fossil red zones.
Red zones in South India.
I'm not familiar with the red zones.
Okay, and then one last question from Yunus Khan, who asks, is there any archaeological studies done in Trans-Himalayas of Ladakh region so far?
Yes, I mean, the ASI has been working out there. The ASI and University of Jammu, they have reported sites, I think, going back at least 10,000 years old, 9,000 years old, showing Neolithic evidence. So it shows temporary prehistoric camps. But nothing older than that has been dated, even though typologically things have been reported from Spiti Valley, for example, like middle Paleolithic and upper Paleolithic tools. These are surface sites and they've not been dated. So there are some sites out there, but without dates. And Ladakh, all this evidence is Neolithic.
Okay, and then one final question, and I think he is one of our students who has quite a lot of interest in this area. Srijit, who asks, but can't proteins also be used to identify the time period? Because proteins have, of course, been used for taxonomic determination, but can they also be used as time markers or time determinants?
It depends on what our knowledge is about the species itself. If it's wide-ranging, then it's very difficult to pinpoint that particular time period. But again, some places you have long-surviving species. Some places you have them disappearing faster. So it depends on the regional context.
Okay, all right. That's a lot of questions. And thank you for being so patient and having answered all of them. So,
yeah. Thank you. Thank you really, Parth Chauhan. I mean, you have been really patient in answering all the questions. There have been all kind of questions, and it's really fascinating to see it has rekindled a lot of interest among so many people, and more pertinent questions and general questions. I believe because of the wider audience, we expect more general questions also here on this platform. Anyways, it's a wonderful talk. Thank you very much for sparing time and to deliver this talk. And I think in future we'll interact much more and can invite you for more talks in the future also. Thank you so much, Parth. And now we close the session.
Thank you for having me.